Jenny Blake is the founder of the Pivot Method, and that's a growth strategy company that works with companies and individuals to map their next steps. And she's actually here with us on campus, helping to co-teach a course about pivoting to students with lecturer Allison Kluger. And we just didn't want to miss this chance and brought her in so that she could also share her wisdom with GSB alumni today. She came into this, she actually got her start in Silicon Valley, among other things, working for 5 years with Google in their training and development organization, and then moved to New York where she founded her consultancy and now works with companies, global companies like Google and Microsoft and Chanel. So we also love her book, which is called Pivot, The Only Move That Matters is Your Next One. It's one that we consider a bit of a staple here within the Career Management Center, and offers a lot of great tips. And she'll walk you through some of her frameworks that she outlines in her book. So Jenny, I think I've kind of gone on for a bit here. It's great to have you back, and I'll hand it over.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm thrilled to be here and to be back. One thing Katie didn't mention is that the 2-week strategic pivoting course that's happening for GSB, Alex Rodriguez is the guest instructor. So when Allison, the professor, first emailed me, it was one of those emails I thought was probably spam, that this can't really be happening. And it's that delightful serendipity that comes from putting something like a book out there into the world. So it's really a joy and an honor for me to be back. If any of you happen to be here for last year's webinar, this one is a pivot on that content, and we're really going to get into how do you do your best work? And then the second half of this session will be quiet time for you to reflect and map your year ahead. Because one of the trickiest resources for smart mid-career professionals, one of the hardest resources to come by is actually not money, and it's not even time, it's space. Space to pause, space to reflect, space to think. When are you your best at work? When was the last time somebody asked you that? When was the last time you asked yourself? And for those of you who are managers or leaders, when was the last time you asked your team that question? When are you your best at work? And there was no better time to have this conversation than a few weeks into the new year. It's that crush and that onslaught of everybody being back to work. The emails start flying, the texts, the meetings, and our plate fills up so quickly that we can very easily find ourselves working in our career and in our businesses, and without taking the time and space to work on our career and to work on our business and really to identify you at your best. So to bring us into this topic today, I would like to start with a short video. If you can't hear the audio too well, that's okay. You'll get the visuals in a minute. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Free Solo. Okay, hopefully I didn't give you too much vertigo. I don't know how many people, I've seen it many times now, but you may be sitting there with your stomach flipped upside down. Certainly worth watching the 2-hour movie Free Solo. I love sharing this clip for 2 reasons. One, sometimes, the whole the whole purpose of my book Pivot that came out in 2016 was to understand, if change is the only constant, how do we get better at it? Because I don't have to tell any of you that the world is moving at a faster clip than it ever has, and our careers, we are being asked to answer that question, what's next, much more often, and pivot within our careers, even within our roles, within our organizations, much more frequently than generations past. And sometimes it can feel like any next move is this matter of life and death. As for Alex Honnold, who is climbing without any ropes, there's no safety net. If he makes the wrong move, he plummets to his demise. And sometimes, because our career is so directly tied to money and earnings and ability to provide for ourselves, food, clothing, shelter, if some of you support families, it feels like there's a lot of pressure on any one next move. So even giving ourselves permission to step back and explore, when am I at my best, sometimes feels like a luxury. One of the students in the strategic pivoting course just the other night had this sense, I could tell there was this glimmer in his eyes, in his gut, and or his heart of hearts. He had an idea of what would be a really exciting next move, but almost immediately he said, but I'm married and I have 2 kids to support. And so it was conflating thinking about what was his calling, what he was being called to do, versus a reality, or again, like we started off, that day-to-day onslaught of tasks and to-dos. So it's not easy to consider taking steps like this, or what feels like really risky next moves. The other reason I love sharing this clip is that we are truly watching somebody who is in a flow state. He is so engaged and raptured in what he's doing. Researcher Mihai Csikszentmihalyi defines a flow state as almost ecstatic bliss, where you're so locked into what you're doing and immersed that time and space dissolve, and it's as if nothing else matters. You're just locked into the zone. That's what athletes would call it, being in the zone, or that flow state where maybe you're doing some type of task at work or within the broader pivot portfolio that you have of personal and professional activities, where the sun could rise and set and you don't even notice. For me, even though it's not directly tied to the work I do now, it used to be coding websites or building later one software like Dreamweaver, now WordPress, then Squarespace. Once software came out, I could just be so happy building a website from sunrise to sunset. Doing a session like this puts me in a flow state where I can be totally present in the moment. So I'd love for you to think about, when are you most in the zone at work? And maybe even take a minute to reflect on, if it hasn't happened yet in the first few weeks of the new year, think about last year or even the last 10 years. What were those highlight moments where you were in that flow state, feeling totally in the zone, almost just blissed out, that ecstatic, enraptured state? My hope is that you have something that comes to mind. And even when I did this exercise for the first time through a company called Helios that looks at how do we create more of a flow state at work, when I did it for the first time, and the way that the instructor of the training brought this up was that we don't really often take the time to unpack how we get in a flow state, let alone ask ourselves, how can I recreate that more often? So maybe we stumble into a flow state almost on accident, like, oh wow, today flew by, today went so fast, whereas other days feels like time is crawling. And on those days where time flies by and we're so engaged and we've had the best day ever and we feel really proud and accomplished, I know for myself, it's rare that I actually take that and I unpack the ingredients and then I say, how can I predict when this flow state will happen at work? And more than that, even, how can I create it? Studies show, of a McKinsey study of executives showed that, and they responded to say that when they are in a flow state at work, they are 5 times more productive. I don't even think I need to tell you this. This is something that we all can feel and experience. Even if you look at your circadian rhythm, we all probably have a certain time of the day where we do our best, most creative, strategic work. For me, that's the mornings. And then, as one of my clients says, in the afternoons, I barely even know my own name. So you can look within a day, when are you most likely to hit a flow state where your energy is peaking, and how can you slot your most strategic projects into that few hour chunk? And then in a given week or a month at work, imagine if you were to be in a flow state even 20% more of the time, you would double your productivity. It would have huge gains for the work that you do. And similarly, again, those of you who are managers and leaders, helping your team members find work that puts them in this state can make everybody happier, more engaged, more productive. And I see a question from Hiral. Will we have slides sent over email? Yes, we will send a PDF of these slides afterward. Thank you. I want to share 3 frameworks to unpack and reverse engineer how you can and how you have in the past found a flow state and you at your best. And then the second half, as I mentioned, we'll get into the 4 stages of the pivot method so that you can take what you've learned about your unique flow ingredients and map those onto how you might build from your current strengths into a really compelling vision for 2020. I mentioned researcher Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote the book, the seminal book called Flow, and he introduced this chart or formula for how we find a flow state. So Csikszentmihalyi says that we can reach a flow state when we have just enough skill and just enough challenge. If we have too much skill and not enough challenge, we get bored. We feel apathetic, we're a little depressed. And I'm sure you've had moments in your career where you felt that boredom. It's as actively uncomfortable as being too challenged at work. Boredom is the worst. And that's often when what I call a pivot plateau, that's often when you or your team would probably think to start making moves, is when you hit that boredom, that plateau for too long. Conversely, if you have too much challenge and not enough skill to meet that challenge, that's what puts us in a state of anxiety and worry. And sometimes it's not just what's happening at work, but maybe what's also happening in your personal life. You've just had a baby, you have twins, who knows? The challenge is so high and you haven't yet built up the skill to navigate it that we become flooded with anxiety. In the pivot context, I call that our panic zone, where it's not even productive anymore. You just more feel paralyzed and frozen, or analysis paralysis, compare and despair. It's not a pleasant state to be in. When we're in a flow state, we actually have just enough skill, but we're still challenged. So you can think about where you currently fall on this spectrum. And if you're someone where you're at a place where you're plateauing a little bit, how can you increase the challenge or the complexity of what you're doing or take things to the next level? And if you're feeling worried, stressed, anxious, how could you simplify or reduce what you're focusing on? Or you know, a framework that when I teach delegation is, what can you and only you do? And for the rest, what can you drop, delegate, or automate? Because now, and of course, GSB grads don't have to tell you, but there's more and more software that can also automate a lot of what we do. And in some cases, if something's really draining or stressful for you, there's someone else who might love that type of work. And as I often find with my team is the case, sometimes nobody needs to do it. Flow state isn't an exact science. I think we're never just, oh yeah, let me hit that yellow upper right-hand part of this graph and then I'm just there for good. But we can usually oscillate and hover somewhere around this in the course of a given week. The next framework comes from a book called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And I read this book probably over 10 years ago, and this one concept has stuck with me ever since. And in the book, Hendricks says that there are 4 zones that we fall into with our work. The first zone is our zone of incompetence. We are not skilled at the work. Many can do this type of work better and with more enjoyment. Now, this is different. If you're going to go take a coding class and you find that you love it, but you're incompetent, you don't know anything yet, it's day 1. That's a little different than the type of tasks that just completely drain you. You're not skilled at them and you don't want to be. For some people, it's spreadsheets. For others, it's event planning. For some, it's customer service. For others, it's being behind a computer all day and not interacting with customers. Our zone of competence is we're okay. We're able to get the job done, but we're still a little bit drained. We just get by. The zone of excellence is actually where things get a little tricky. And many of us can be trapped by excellence, especially think about your career. I know for myself, you know, I grew up in Palo Alto, I went to UCLA, worked at a startup, worked at Google for a long, long time. In that trajectory, I was sort of rewarded for excellence, being good at things, maybe even being known for certain types of things at work. But the trick of the zone of excellence is that although we are skilled, it can actually limit our genius because we get overloaded by things that we're good at and maybe even excellent at and known for, but they're not our zone of genius. So our zone of genius is really where we find that flow state. This is unique to you. It is you at your best. And a quick shorthand formula for finding your zone of genius or reworking your workflow to get to that zone of genius more often is by looking at, and this comes from the company Helios that I mentioned, looking at adding more of the activities that energize you, that you look forward to on your to-do list or in your calendar, and really being mindful of what drains you and reducing those drainers, those zone of incompetence or incompetence tasks. And at some point, depending where you are in your career trajectory and where you are in your organization, you may need to say no to the good. This is a John Maxwell quote. Say no to the good so you can say yes to the best. So at some point, you may have to start saying no or trying to reduce the level of even excellent type tasks that you're working on so that you can do more of your zone of genius. Now, we're still a little amorphous. Well, what does this zone of genius mean? Of course, on some level, you'll know it when you see it. But I really like the definition that comes from a friend of mine, Mike Michalowicz, who wrote a great book called Clockwork. It's helpful if you run a small business like I do, but even if not, he talks about this queen bee role. And he's talking about this in the context of a CEO. But you can think about it within your career or within your role at work. So think about bees in a beehive. All the worker bees are there to protect the queen bee so that she can do what she does best, which is lay eggs. And everyone else's job is to protect her. So we don't all, depending on your situation and your level, you might not all have a team whose sole job is to protect you. However, you can still think about your queen bee role for where you're at in your career, in your organization, is a combination of what you are known for. What are you the go-to person for at work? Or what do you become known for most often, where you get complimented or thank you notes? What would people miss if you were gone? And what's an activity that supports your role promise? So what was in parentheses was your brand promise if you're running a business, let's say. But even within a role, there's a certain role promise of what you're doing. And these are the core vital activities. If we 80-20 it, it's the 20% of your work that actually delivers on the most important outcomes and impact for your role. So, and by the way, I've given pivot keynotes and I piloted, which is my word for kind of experimenting with, I mean, I didn't make it up, but it's part of the pivot method is pilot. So I piloted this content at an admin summit for a large tech company in the Bay Area. And it's interesting that even within the role of admin or admin business partner, everybody raised their hands at different points about what they were known for within that same job title of admin. You could have the same job title of COO or Chief Operations Officer, and still you would be known for something very different than another COO. So no matter what your job title is on paper, it is worth asking, what are you known for within it? What would people miss? And what are the unique activities that you do that make you great at what you do? I see a question from Henry who says, what if you have a lot of drainers and can't get out of them? I've totally been there. And one thing that's helpful is to track for 2 weeks exactly what those drainers are. And I've done this in several ways. You could, on the left-hand side of a page, write drainers, and on the right-hand side, write energizers. Sometimes I like having a sort of lukewarm category in the middle. And then sometimes I'll even track based on those zones of competence, excellence, genius, or maybe all four, incompetence. And what I find, Henry, is getting really specific on exactly what they are, because sometimes we're in a position where we just think, my job drains me, or I'm drained. I reached a point when I was at Google where I felt like I was only in my zone of genius really 10 to 20% of the time, where I was facilitating, coming up with new trainings, new programs, new curriculum, delivering it. And then the rest of the time I was in meetings and doing strategy PowerPoint decks. But without the language to communicate it, it's hard to even have those conversations about what is it specifically that drains you. And then within each of those, after you've tracked for about 2 weeks, you could start to look at, where is there even a possibility of moving some of this off your plate? And again, looking at do, drop, delegate. You might not have an answer right away. And some of this may be to help facilitate a question with your manager or your business partner, somebody that you work with, where you even say, I'm not sure, I just took this class on pivoting and mapping your best work, and I got some insights around the things that are draining me. And I know here's what really energizes me. I know I could make 5 times the impact if I could do more of these energizers and less of the drainers. And you can even say, I know we may not have the answers overnight about how to shift some of these drainers, but I would love your help brainstorming. And I'll tell you, I have a small team, and I say to them, I will not take it personally if you come to me about what I always want them to tell me what drains you. I always want to know. I don't believe that they should be doing anything really that drains them. I mean, we all have maybe 10 to 20% of administrative stuff, but if there's somebody on my team that's the majority of their work drains them, that's not a good situation for anybody to be in, and it's not how we're going to get the best out of that person and how they're going to look forward to doing the work every day. So once I know what their drainers are, I never take it personally. It's an opportunity for us to discuss, brainstorm, and figure out more creative ways to tackle the work. And often we find even better solutions that are more efficient, that mean that they are continually elevating themselves to think and act more and more strategically, because we continue in an ongoing way moving their drainers off their plate. So having shared these 3 frameworks, the Mihaly-Csikszentmihalyi intersection of skill and challenge, the Gay Hendricks from The Big Leap, the zone of genius, or the 4 zones, and then this last one, the queen bee role. Just think about which of these resonates, which one clicks, even if you take energizers, drainers as its own concept. Which of these resonates? I'm purposely giving you a menu because at different points in my life and career, these have jumped out to me more strongly and been more helpful. Just pick one of them and start to ask what levers you could adjust to find a flow state more frequently. And as you reflect on this, I actually want to launch a poll. So I just launched it. Hopefully you can see it. I'm curious to know, a little ways into this conversation, what percentage you currently feel you're in a flow state at work. And I encourage you to spend the next 2 weeks observing. And it's okay if you are one of those that said 10%, 20%. I have been there. And there's oftentimes how we know it's time to pivot, or we're at a plateau where we're simply not doing that unique queen bee role work that we and only, you and only you can do. And that's okay. That's normal. It's one of the things that when I give the main pivot keynote is that your plateaus and your pivot points are not a problem, and they are not a personal shortcoming. It's usually a signal that you've just outgrown whatever it is that you were doing previously. And that's normal. I wrote the book for people who I call high net growth, that money is important, but it's not everything. You want to know, am I learning? Am I growing? Am I making an impact? So sometimes we have a great job. We're working for a dream company, great brand recognition, great resume booster. And yet we just still have hit a plateau. And it often opens up once you've had time to reflect and be sort of clear on you at your best. That can then open up conversations that can lead to creative solutions down the road, even if it doesn't happen quite overnight. So it looks like you are seeing these poll results. We about, let's see, 23% are at 0 to 10%. Might be, it's good timing that you're here for this workshop so we can start to map what might be next with even within your current role. Pivoting doesn't always have to be big, giant moves. Looks like about almost 50% said 11 to 25%. 15% say 26 to 40, and then over 40%, 40, 50, 60, and above looks like about 10%. Something to know too is that we are all in kind of just the wild, wild west of technology, and I call it peak ping. We're all figuring this out together. Nobody has it solved. I speak at large organizations all the time, and I see how tired people are, and myself included. It's overwhelming, the amount of messages and inboxes. Even you have your email inbox, your LinkedIn inbox, your Facebook if you use it, whatever other social media you're on, your work email, your requests for meetings. So you are not alone if you're one that you feel you're in a flow state less than half the time. We're all trying to solve this and trying to figure out how do we reduce some of that just noise. And it just tends to happen whether you're at a startup or a bigger or emerging growing company. It is something that if you can solve it, and the fact that you're here taking time to step back and really ask these questions, even you can sit with some of these questions after the session, you will be leading the way. You will be part of a group that says the way we're working isn't working and there's a better way. And for me, I definitely am focusing on how do I simplify so that I can do more of what's in my unique zone of genius. On that note, you may not have the answers to all of this overnight. I love this concept from poet David White. He's an author as well and actually does a lot of speaking. He lives in the Bay Area. He says that a beautiful question, it's not one you can just answer right away in the moment, but it has to be lived. So a beautiful question starts to shape your identity as much by asking it as it does by having it answered. You just have to keep asking. And before you know it, you will find yourself actually shaping a different life, meeting different people, finding conversations that are leading you in those directions that you wouldn't have even seen before. Sit with some of these concepts that I've shared with you already and know that these are beautiful questions. So how often are you in a flow state at work? You know, even that you could live into, but consider a question like, what is my deepest truth? It's not one that you would answer right away. You would live it. You would ask it every day. So similarly, what is the work that you and only you can do? What is it that is your reason for being on this planet? I mean, that's as big as it gets. It might be too much pressure. I like to think about project-based purpose within the role you have now, within the company that you're at, or that maybe some of you have your own business, you're running your own company. What are you here to bring to the world or to that role? What is it that lights you up? These are questions that it helps to live into them. And that's why that observing and tracking over the next few weeks will give you a lot of insights that will evolve over time. Even they would tell us in coach training that I did CTI in 2008, that most coaching doesn't happen during a session, and maybe even most learning doesn't happen right now, real time, or those of you watching the recording. It's going to happen in the weeks afterward, where you're marinating and, as my friend says, crock-potting ideas. You're walking, commuting, showering, and boom, aha, you start to have more insights and more awareness. Now's a good time to get out a pen and paper if you don't have one nearby. Those good old analog devices of pen and paper, which are becoming increasingly rare. We're going to move into taking this reflection that we've done so far about finding more of a flow state at work and put it into the 4-stage pivot method framework. So the pivot method, pivot is a mindset and it's a method. The mindset is, if change is the only constant, let's get better at it. And the method is a 4-stage process to help us all improve at mapping what's next. And again, even within the role that you have, because in fact, the best pivots start right where you already are. You don't have to start from scratch. We can build from what's working to help you shift methodically into what's next. And it's a great time of year to do that because we're at the start of the year and start of a new decade. No pressure. The first stage of the pivot method is plant. And this comes from a basketball player analogy where when a basketball player stops dribbling, one foot stays planted, and then their pivot foot can scan for passing options around the court. And one thing I noticed, a mistake that I've made in the past, and I've been self-employed now almost 10 years, and even in the time that I was at Google and coaching and training thousands of people at Google, was that so many of us look for answers outside of ourselves. We have no plant foot. We're not grounded in who we are and what's already working. And instead, we're so focused on what's next, what's out there, that we waste a lot of time spinning and worrying that isn't that productive and that doesn't move things forward. So the plant stage has two parts. It's about identifying what are your current strengths, both in terms of what's working and also what are you enjoying most, and what is your vision 1 year from now. If you happen to have a 5-year vision or a 10-year vision, that's great. But I find for most people, that's just too abstract, and life and the world changes so much. I don't know how many of you could even predict you'd be where you are today 5 or 10 years ago. So I like 1-year vision. It can be 2. You can set this if you've just started a new role. Maybe you want to do a 6-month vision of what is success in my first 6 months on the job, or my first 90 days even. When we think about strengths, going back to some of what we've talked about with finding a flow state, strengths, we often think of competencies. Oh, okay, strengths are things that I'm good at, what you've spent your career cultivating. But another important part of strengths is what energizes you. Going back to that flow state, that zone of genius. So these are things that you're intrinsically motivated, that, it's the type of work you would want to do even if nobody was paying you, which hopefully you are, but it's what you would do with your free time. It's what my friend Neil Pasricha calls your Saturday morning test. These are your true strengths. They're the intersection of what you are good and skilled and talented at, but that also gets you out of bed in the morning, that when you see it on your to-do list, you're actually looking forward to it. So keep that in mind. And I'm going to give you now about 2 minutes to reflect. And in fact, yes, I'll set a timer. I want you to take about 1 minute for this first question and try to jot down as much as you can for what is working best right now, personally and professionally. What energizes you most? So we are now taking an inventory. What have you been most excited to get back to in the new year? And I say personally and professionally because they both have you in common. What are you the go-to person for at work? What types of projects do you enjoy most? What are some activities that you've done throughout your life, even as a child, that are recurring themes? Part 2, and by the way, sometimes I'll spend a month or more with coaching clients on each of the 4 stages of the pivot method. So 1 minute is really nothing, but I'm giving you time to just understand what the pivot method is, get to know the framework, and then I do really encourage you to spend a little more time with this after the webinar ends. You can view the recording, check out the slides. So take a minute now to brainstorm, what does success look like 1 year from now? Don't worry whether it's possible or not. You won't have to share this with anyone. Don't worry about how you would achieve it. If it's realistic, try to go big, be creative. 1 year from now, or by the end of this year, what would you be thrilled to have happening in your life and work? Think about your environment, your ideal average day. How would you be excited to learn and grow in the year ahead? What kind of impact would you love to make? So if you were going to win an award for something, or even receive a glowing thank you note, what would it be for? Try not to lift your pen from the page. If you think you're out of ideas, it means it's everything you already know about yourself. It's nothing new. So I challenge you, push through, take a couple, maybe 60 more seconds, and also try to stretch a little bit. So go sideways. What is coming to mind that would be kind of wacky or off the wall, or you don't know how it has to do with the work that you do now, but what would be something really exciting that you would be proud to have at least experimented with by the end of the year? Okay. The second stage of the pivot method is scan. So once you are rooted, once you are grounded in what's already working and generally what success looks like 1 year from now, now we can go to the second stage, which is scan. Scanning is about saying, based on what's working and generally where you want to end up, what's out there. So this is based on three primary things, based on what you wrote down in the plan stage: people, skills, and projects that could help you start to bridge this gap between where you are now and where you'd like to end up. And again, I never expect anybody to know exactly their specific 1 year vision, but you kind of have a sense of how you want to feel, how you want to learn and grow, what kind of impact you want to make. So now we can scan for people, skills, and projects to help us get there. The big mistake that many pivoters make is they jump right to scanning. Oh, I've hit a pivot point. I'm at a plateau. I'm only in a flow state 5% of the time at work. What's out there? And the first thing that we do is start looking at job boards and talking to people. And that can be a frustrating process because it's not grounded in what is working and what you're already best at and the experience and connections you already have under your belt. So when it comes to brainstorming, take a minute and jot down names or types of people. Who do you admire? And who could you talk to that might help you with clues toward this 1 year vision that you've just started brainstorming? Think about who is doing the work that you've identified for your 1 year vision. Maybe pieces of it, doesn't have to be the whole picture. Who has already served as a mentor to you throughout your career? What about friend tours? Friends who are mentors, friends who inspire you, energize you, help hold you accountable. Think about who could you learn from, even from afar. Now we have so many ways to study from people, whether it's their book, their podcast. I know for me, it works both ways. I have a pivot podcast that I've had for 5 years. And there are people who say, oh yeah, I listen to you every day when I'm commuting or every week. And then there are people that I listen religiously to their podcast and I feel like we're best friends and they have no idea I exist. So I'm big on, even if you can't talk to this person or you certainly don't know them yet, maybe someday you will. Who are people that you respect that you could learn from that could inform some of your career choices and pilots, even from afar? And by the end of 2020, who would you be really thrilled to get to know or connect with or reconnect with? So these can be people that are in your immediate network that you want to cultivate relationships with. You might even write down a type of person. So you don't know their name yet, but you have a sense for type of industry or type of role. Part 2 of scanning, take a minute and write down what new skills both interest you, what energizes you in terms of your learning, growth, and development, and also what would move you closest toward your 1 year vision. So anytime, and again, I use pivot to refer to mapping our growth for the year ahead, even within the role that you have. But anytime we identify success 1 year from now, there's a gap. And that's what keeps us engaged, is learning and growing and evolving as people and professionals to bridge that gap. So there's a part of us that loves that challenge. And I encourage you to understand what new skills could help you bridge that gap. These could be soft skills like leadership, presentation skills, although soft, I think that word is out. And I need to replace it myself, because those are such crucial skills. But it could also be technical skills. This could also be personal learning of what energizes you. So things for fun, cooking, dance classes. The third stage of the pivot method is pilot. This is like the basketball player passing the ball around the court, and it's really about small experiments to help you test what's next. Most people try to solve their pivot up front, and they think only once I know the answer of what's next, then I'll take action on it. It's the reverse. Pilots, think about racehorses at the Kentucky Derby. You don't have to know which one's going to win. Your job is to line up some small experiments, 10 to 20% of your time or your role, and let your pilots show you which ones are gaining traction. A good career pilot will help you determine 3 E's. Do you enjoy this area? Can you become an expert at it? And is there room to expand? So think about, with everything we've talked about today, what are some small experiments that you could put in place? What could you do in the next month? Maybe your pilot is stop checking email after 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., whatever feels radical for you, after 6, 5, you choose. Maybe a pilot is carving out 1 or 2 hours first thing in the morning where you don't let anybody schedule time on your calendar, and you always pick out what's your one most strategic project. You pick it out the night before, and you know every day you're going to work on that, or you do that for 4 days in a row and see how you feel at the end of the week. You can also think about what are some pilots you could run that are a little bigger in scope that you could run in the next 6 months that would most inform your 1-year vision and help you get there. So what would that look like of some bigger pilots? Maybe it's going to an introductory class. It's shadowing someone, setting up a lunch, taking a 6-week course in something, taking on a new project at work, volunteering for, like at Google, we have the Career Guru program where senior level directors and leaders learn to become career coaches, and then they facilitate a handful of coaching sessions every month. So maybe there's employee resource groups that you're passionate about or that you want to be a part of, or something in your personal life that you want to experiment with, something related to health and fitness, that this one change could make a huge impact. So take the pressure off to have the answer, and instead think about it in terms of these experiments. The fourth and final stage is launch. We won't go too far into this today. There's 2 types of launches, kind of going all in a new direction once you've reduced risk through the earlier stages. And what I would consider a little L launch is just after attending this session today, what are 1 or 2 small next steps that you're going to take? Ultimately, pivot and the pivot method is a cycle. It's not a linear one and done process. Really, nothing is. That's just not how our world works anymore. It's a constant, ongoing cycle of questions. At its core, the pivot method boils down to what's working, what does success look like, what's out there, what can I try? So if you remember nothing else from this session, it's very simply asking, what can I try? There is no way you can know exactly what's going to work and what's going to be the one best next step, but you can try different things and let those experiments gain momentum on their own. So as we wrap up and open it up for questions, I would love for you to, if you have brainstormed with pen and paper, you can go through and circle the 5 items that stand out the most. And I'd love to even know in the chat, what's one small step you'll take in the next week, and what one next step would make the biggest impact. And by the way, these 2 questions you could ask of yourself every week if you want to move your pivot planning forward. So what's one small step you'll take this week or next week? and what one next step would make the biggest impact? And I would love to hear from those of you who are willing to share. So before we can throw these questions in the chat and before I take questions, I also wanted to let you know there are a lot more resources on my website. If you go to pivotmethod.com/toolkit, there's a free toolkit with a lot of these exercises in Google Docs and various forms that you can spend more time on each of the stages. And my favorite exercise is at pivotmethod.com/idealday. And that's really fun. It can help you think through, it's a Mad Lib where you just have to fill in the blanks of what your ideal day might look like for 2020. And Pivot Podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. So great. I see we have a couple questions coming in. The first one's from Patty. So Patty asks, are pilots meant to be linked to bridging the skill gaps or more of a habit change training? Pilots can be anything. I just like breaking the whole notion of career change or career development can be kind of ambiguous and feel often intimidating for people. Maybe you have a pivot in mind within your role, within the company, or within your career, and it's intimidating. You don't know where to start. So a good pilot would help you say, do I want to move in this direction? So for me with coach training in 2008, I had 2 coaching sessions that were so transformative that my pilot was to go attend an evening introductory seminar to what is coaching. And that went so well that I decided to sign up for the first weekend that CTI calls fundamentals. That went so well, I decided to go through the rest of the training and certification. Even with something like, for me, the Pivot podcast, I started it 5 years ago. I thought it was just going to be this side project related to the book. And I didn't have any intro and outro music. I taught myself audio editing through GarageBand. And it was so scrappy, but I didn't let that hold me back. I didn't wait for it to be perfect. I just launched it. At Google, we had a mantra, launch and iterate, and get scrappy is a Google mantra. And now, 5 years later, it has been priceless to me. It is how I've made so many friends, connected with mentors. It brings me so much joy and fulfillment. It earns the least revenue in my business, but brings me the most happiness. And it's one of the favorite things that I do. But I couldn't have known that at the outset. I had to just get going and in a small and imperfect way and let it build organically over time.
Do you see this next one here about
Great.
navigating a pivot where you're flowing, but the job or industry is radically changing, as many are, and you're concerned that your current role will be disintermediated?
Yeah, I think there are so many of us who have been in this position where you can see how much change is happening. And I think everybody confronts that question of what if. I'm running my own business and I think to myself, what if the economy goes down or I lose business or I lose this big client? And so there's a part of our lives and careers that will always be oriented toward that worst case scenario. And I think to the extent that that helps you understand how can I ensure that I'm making the biggest impact that I can and that I am indispensable. I really love the book Linchpin by Seth Godin along those lines about how do you become that indispensable linchpin and strategic thinker and problem solver so that you do have a little more job security, knowing that none of us really have job security anymore and we can't. And so we're all having to live with more of that uncertainty and anxiety. And if you feel that, you're not alone. And I would also try to complement that with, and what does success look like? And you can even have that conversation. What would if I knock this out of the park? What does that look like? And so I try to, whenever I have a fear-based thought, what if it all falls apart? What if I lose my job or my client? I like to also ask, well, how could I get 5 more clients? Or how can I earn twice as much in half the time with joy and ease while serving the highest good? So I like to always sort of ask questions that are going to generate a creative and pilot friendly answer where I may not know the answer, but I could certainly pilot and try to experiment and get closer to it. And I see there's also a question from Cherise, so I just wanted to address that briefly. Cherise said, I'm ready to pivot to stop dismissing my calling out of fear of not meeting my family responsibilities as the breadwinner in my home. I so get it, Cherise. And that's amazing you were at the Women at event. I'm so happy that you're here. And yeah, I think leaving Google and some pivots are going to be within a company. I've seen so many people at Google and other organizations create entirely new roles for themselves by starting with a 10 or 20% project that they show the value of it over time. They show their skills, they grow their capabilities, network, and that 10% can become a full-time role. And I've seen it over and over. But then sometimes we're ready and we know our heart is calling us toward a bigger pivot, and it might be leaving a company like Google. And one thing that we haven't gotten into, we don't have time to get into today, but is that fear of not being associated with the big fancy brand. And it's a big identity shift. So just know that pivoting often involves leaving something good, where people might even say, oh, you're crazy to leave that thing. And we there's this beautiful story called The Parable of the Trapeze by Dan Imperi. And he talks about how you let go of the old trapeze bar, but there's this moment of suspension before you grab the next bar where you're not holding on to anything. And it's terrifying and it's exhilarating and it's the only way forward. But it's being willing to make that leap of faith and saying, I don't know who I am outside of this job that I've had for so long, or this title, or this company brand, but I'm willing to find out. And for me, piloting and doing things slowly, methodically, that's why I wrote Pivot, was that I'm not that super risk-taking person where I was willing to just like throw caution to the wind. And, I have taken risks, definitely, but I like to do it in a more methodical way. And so what I share in the book, what we touched on today, is how I build my own courage. And at a certain point, as I talk about in the book, you can't wait until you feel 100% courageous or 100% confident. It just doesn't work like that. That I often say you've got to embrace your insecurity and your anxiety and the uncertainty, because that's not necessarily going to go away until after you've made the moves and you realize, oh, I can survive. Life is fine. I can do this. And even now, I love Google. Google's still one of my clients. I still work with them today and speak a lot with Google, and I love them, but I also love being self-employed and partnering with them in that way. So it's a pivot in that they're still part of my ecosystem, but people have asked me, do you regret leaving? Even at the times my business was totally at rock bottom, I didn't know if I could keep it going even another month. At those times, I still didn't regret leaving. So there's almost no one that I spoke with for the book when I was doing interviews that ever regretted moves that they had made. For so many of us, decisions are data, and it helps us keep moving.
I see one. It actually came through the chat, Jenny, about asking about suggestions for continuing to reflect more frequently and stay on a good path.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that. So, Kristen, I think if I were you, I would want to know when you feel most ripe for reflection. For me, it's in the early mornings. It's a dream if I can wake up before sunset, which means that I've gone to bed early enough the night before. But when you feel most quiet, for you, could be walking, could be going for a walk outside. The most important thing is that you just designate that time. So maybe for you, it's going to be Friday mornings or Friday afternoons or on the weekend. But even for now, just picking, okay, this 30 minutes of any week or 15 minutes of every day is for me, and is for me to pause and reflect. And I think it's easy to fill our lives with so much content now, books, podcasts, TV shows, that it's easy to fill our mind and reflection time, and it's much harder to carve it out. So I really enjoy walk and talks with friends. That's a little different than this individual reflection. But maybe you can think back for you, Kristen, of the times that you have carved out that space for reflection, what tends to really work well for you, and pilot small experiments or small ways to start adding some of that back in.
Well, maybe this other question kind of relates, because an attendee asked, what do you recommend for involving a spouse in the process of using the pivot method?
Yeah. And I was going to say too, for Kristen, maybe you're kind of like me. Maybe you want to just go all out on a 5-day silent retreat, or you want to go away for the weekend, or you need more of a getaway. So there's like you could be the type of person who wants to work it in a small way every day, or you might need to just go schedule a day completely to yourself at the spa. My friend just did that. She has a partner and a small daughter. And for her birthday, she just went to Kripalu. I live in New York City, and she went, it's near there, where she just went and was by herself and did yoga and got a massage and had good food all day. So that's another approach that has often worked well for me. And I love the question too about involving a spouse. Yeah, it can be so fun to ask each other these questions and just setting aside the time. A lot of people will come up to me, let's say at the end of a book signing, and say, it's my husband who really needs this book, or my wife, where you have a spouse who feels a little stuck. So it depends. Some people have a dynamic where you love thinking, coaching, reflecting, discussing together. And then for some people, it feels like, oh, my partner doesn't want to hear it from me, but I know that he needs it or she needs it. So certainly, definitely, I know people where just giving a copy of the book has been a helpful kickstart. But I love the idea, if you can take time together, you can ask someone. When I teach Pivot to managers and directors, we work through the model in 10 minutes. So if you could even set aside 30 minutes or an hour, and then split the time where one of you is asking the questions for the first half, and then you flip roles and the other one asks. They don't need to have any answers at all. And in fact, the best coaching, the coach is really being a facilitator, just like the best podcasts are often interviewers like Oprah, where she just asks incredibly powerful questions. You don't need any more questions even than we went over today, that you'll get the slides. And so you, without adding any input, maybe brainstorming together when it comes to brainstorming pilots, but you can just walk each other through the framework. And I find whenever I teach it that way and have people coach each other, there's always insights that shake out by the end of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. You know, we don't have any more questions, which is actually pretty good, because I think we need to wrap up. And thank you for your time. This is a great launch pad to move forward. And I want to thank everybody who's with us today as well. If you would, there is a short survey in the chat. If you could click on that link and give us some feedback about today's session, we'd really value that. And do that. As I wrap up, I just want to talk about some things that could help you move forward, offerings from this Career Management Center, including one-on-one coaching. Could be one way to move forward, and you can access that through our website, as well as 2 upcoming programs. These are actually virtual series, so you can join us from anywhere. The first launches next week, called Jumpstart Your Job Search. Now, this is if you're kind of further along maybe in this pivot process and you're really ready to dive into a job search. This is all about job search strategy and tactics, and it runs over the course of 3 weeks. And a little further out is a session, a 4-week session called Clarify Your Next Career Move. And it digs deeper into a lot of the things Jenny talked about today, in helping to orient you towards what a next right step might look like for you, how to establish those experiments, and so on. So we'll send out some links so you can explore some more, and we'll definitely hope that you can attend one or some of our upcoming sessions. And even though I do see a few more questions coming in, we'll try and answer those offline if needed. And we just thank you, Jenny, for a really inspiring session to get us going. And a happy new year to all of you.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I was muted,
Oh,
but
you were muted, I know.
I wanted to say thank you, Katie, and big thanks to everybody for being here. I know it's not an easy time of year to take time out and to do this kind of thing, and I'm so impressed to hear all the resources you have available to you as follow-ups. I encourage you, if you can get coaching through the GSB resources, do that. It's such a good way to follow up on this content. And again, all the free resources and templates are at pivotmethod.com/.
And we'll send those out as a follow-up to today's session.
Great.
So take care, everyone. Happy New Year.
Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year.